Okay, in this video we're covering the purl stitch. And again, the basics of knitting are you cast on, you knit, you purl, you might do a few fancy stitches in between, and then you cast off. You get that down, you pretty much got it. So we're going to start with the purl stitch. And this stitch, you have your working yarn. It's going to be in front, like in between your needle and you. So your working yarn is in the front of the work. And then you put your needles, they're going to go tip to tip, which means your left needle is going to go in, kind of hit the tip there and go into the loop from right to left. I always have to think about that for a minute. You're going to take your working yarn, wrap it around the needle. That new loop you just made, that becomes the new stitch, and we're going to drop that old stitch off. Tip to tip, or purlwise, we go into the loop, we wrap around, new stitch on, old stitch off. Go in purlwise, wrap around, new stitch on, old stitch off. Let's get some more yarn here. And this is the purl stitch. So you wrap around, put the new stitch on, the old stitch off. This stitch is a yarn over. We'll talk about those in a minute, and I'll show you why that looks a little bit different. But you're going to go in purlwise, wrap the yarn around the back, new stitch on, pull the old stitch off. Let's finish up this row real quick. We'll take a look at it and I'll point some things out about it. So I've been using this same piece to show you different things, so there's a whole lot going on this little swatch here. Okay, there we go. So let me show you some things about a purl stitch. Purl stitch, I like to think of it as like a purl on a purl needle. So you'll see it's referred to as a little purl bump, that little bump there. So that's the purl bump of a purl stitch. Actually, if you were to look at this, a purl stitch is just the back side of a knit stitch. So over here is the front side. You know, the opposite side of that purl stitch looks like a V, and on the back, when you're working on the row, you'll see this little purl bump here. So that's what the purl stitch looks like when you're working on it. Okay, now we have just cast on our stitches, and we used the long tail cast on. So here's a little tip about the long tail cast on. When you're doing that cast on, you're actually knitting on the first row. So we've actually knit a whole row of stitches, and that first set of stitches is already knit. So when we turn our work, if your pattern called for stockinette, it'd just be time to purl. So actually, the first thing I'm going to show you is the purl stitch. So you're going to take the needle in your right hand, and you're going to go into the stitch purlwise. Whenever you're going tip to tip, that is called purlwise. The yarn, the working yarn, which is the yarn that's attached to your ball, is in the front, and it's going to go around the needle. And you're going to catch that loop you just made and pull off that old stitch. So we're going to go tip to tip, or purlwise, into the stitch, wrap around, and you're going to catch that loop you just made. You're pulling this stitch on the left needle off, and that's kind of going below the stitch you just made on your needle, because these stitches, when they fall off, they're going to become the fabric of whatever it is you're making. So tip to tip, go in the front, wrap around, and catch. Just do that a few more times. Actually, I'm just going to go all the way across. It won't take that long. When we get to the end, I'll show you the knit stitch. Tip to tip, wrap the yarn around, pull the old loop off, leave the new loop on. Tip to tip or purlwise. And your working yarn is always in the front when you're doing this purl stitch. There you go. One more real quick. There you go. So when you have pearls, they make a little bump. You'll hear it referred to as the purl bump. I always think of a pearl necklace. So when you're doing a purl stitch, you're going to see a little purl bump. There you go.